This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the 5th week of October 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Appreciate you joining us on this Thursday afternoon. You know these guys by now, right? I'll give them an introduction anyway. This is Luke Thomas from the SiriusXM Fight Club and MMAfighting.com. That is Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com. And of course, the man with the hat anchoring the show, as always, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. You know, guys, I was thinking this morning, all of us represent different states. Do you know that?
That's true.
New York, I don't really know, is it district?
I represent the only place in the country without a state, just the city of D.C.
There you go. Apropos. Jeff Wagenheim.
Massachusetts.
Connecticut.
How about that?
Yeah.
What a worldly show we have here.
Mm-hmm. That's right, because when Chia Pettit was here, it was still...
It was two Connecticut.
Yeah. All right.
I don't know. I was
Good
just
thing
thinking
he's
that.
gone.
Yeah, exactly.
No, dude.
All right, let's move along, guys. Another interesting week in the world of MMA, coming off UFC 179, of course, but we're not going to start there. Wednesday night, the UFC just gave us an avalanche of news. And one of the most interesting pieces of news was that Ronda Rousey versus Kat Zingano has now been moved from January 3rd to February 28th in Los Angeles, of course, Staples Center. We talked about that show, headlined by Chris Weidman versus Vitor Belfort. And I thought this was interesting because, once again, you know, this will be Ronda Rousey's 5th fight in the UFC. And she headlined the first against Liz Carmouche. Then she headlined UFC 170, but she will not be headlining this card. And, you know, they tell us that she's the biggest star, and she is, in fact, one of the biggest, you know, stars and faces of the UFC. But yet, I wonder why they don't put her in the headlining act. There are only so many pay-per-views and so many champions who can actually draw. Why do you think they keep putting her on a co-main event? She was co-main event in her last fight at UFC 175.
Yeah, well, I'm hugely in favor of it. And I know what it winds up creating is, I'm a big believer that I'll take a bad pay-per-view if it means we can get something like 178. Now, 178 had the main event that was ultimately ruined in a way, but the rest of that card was great. And so I'm a bigger fan of Feast or Famine than I am just sort of general malaise. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, I mean, one, it's an insurance policy. If one of those other fights, or even other fights on the card, besides the main or co-main event falls out, you still have sort of a grandeur to the card. Two, she's from LA,
right,
the LA area, so there's a little bit of a hometown draw. Because
makes more sense than Vegas, right?
It does, and it's hard to draw at the gate in LA, right, because they're so accustomed to it. So that, I think that helps a little bit. But, you know, really, I was looking at Jose Aldo, who's one of these guys who fans sort of fret about whether he gets the attention he deserves. I believe in his first 5 UFC defenses, because he, like Rousey, started as champion in their UFC tenure, he had 3 events he headlined, but I think 2 of them, two of them were in Brazil. Right, so the question for me is, if Rousey was from another country that she was energizing and helping to push, maybe we'd see her in a more prominent role, but she's American, and so as a consequence, I don't know that it's so much as a second fiddle as is she's plugging a lot of promotional holes and needs that they have. Yes, Cormier Jones can headline basically anywhere, but I really think it's a nice compliment. It's good for the fans, it's good for the pay-per-view. I'm okay with it.
Only so many champions, though. Right. I kind of feel like, why double up? You know, UFC 181, there are going to be 2 championship fights. Why not spread it out so you can at least have one big championship fight on every pay-per-view at least? Because that's what they want to do now, right?
I think that pay-per-views should be special. I think the two championship fights on a pay-per-view makes it special, regardless of who those champions are. I mean, they will have, 10 champions when they crown a strawweight champion coming up. And if some of those are not big draws, probably the strawweights won't be a big draw. A lot of the lighter weight champions are not as big draws. So anytime they can double them up, that's the way. You know, we've talked a lot about overexposure of the UFC and all these cards. Well, one of the things that can distinguish a pay-per-view that you're being asked to pay $55 for versus a fight card you can see on Fox or Fox Sports 1 or just online, the big difference should be something that makes it special. And if you can put two championship fights on there, that's special, I think.
It's funny when we talk about her as the biggest star, because I feel like what they really mean is she's a transcendent star. She's going to draw other chapters of press that maybe some other fighters won't do that. Will they translate into pay-per-view buys? That's always where it comes down to. If she's in a magazine like Vogue, say, is that audience going to buy the pay-per-view?
Right.
Probably not. And I feel like that's really where this distinction comes in. It was funny because she was on 157. They rolled out the red carpet. So that was like the inaugural. It was a historic event, and it did something like 450,000 pay-per-view buys, which was pretty good. That's a lot better.
Exceeded expectations.
Yeah, exceeded expectations. It was better. I'm a little surprised because I know her next one that she headlined it didn't do as well. It did like somewhere in the 350 range. But we had been talking about her as like, she's got this Mike Tyson vibe. She's starting to destroy people. So the allure was almost like put her in the main event because people will tune in just to see her destroy somebody like Mike Tyson was. And she did that against Alexis Davis in her last outing, and I really thought that they would try to capitalize on that sort of momentum a little bit and sort of play that angle a little bit. But so I guess I was a little bit surprised. I completely understand she's the LA getting people through the gate. Sort of they've done decent numbers in the 500,000 range with her and Weidman kind of co-sharing these cards before. So I get it on one level. But another level, I really thought that this would be her time. Especially, I think Kat Zingano's a pretty good challenge for her. Maybe one of the best ones we've seen. Yeah.
Also, kind of funny, as you mentioned, third straight time that she's doubling up with Chris Weidman. Yeah. And I know there was some talk of the fact that they have the same agent, but that's a very new development. I really don't think one has anything to do with the other. This, as you mentioned as well, is a highly anticipated fight. Kat Zingano fight is one that we've been talking about for quite some time. I feel like Ronda could do it on her own. And I don't know if it's just the timing, and that probably has something to do with it. And there are only so many title fights you could put on pay-per-view. But I think it would be nice to put her out there on her own. And I wonder if it almost devalues her fight by making her, the second fiddle, so to speak. You don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, if Rousey was headlining a card, that means everything below it is less than Rousey, which is a lot of the UFC. But that just means that she then has to do all the grunt work for a promotion, which I don't think she's necessarily all that excited about doing. And I don't mean doing.
But she's good at it, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's a lot to ask from someone like that. Second of all, like, we sit here and complain about pay-per-views. Oh, look at this! Look how nubs this pay-per-view is. I got 1 or 2 fights I care about. Now you've got, literally, the rest of that card could be garbage. It's not, or either card really could be garbage. You could have Jones Cormier is going to be fine by itself, and Weidman Machida. People are going to pay for that anyway. But now you really have a special moment. You have something to really capture people's attention. And I think Weidman and Vitor could sell on their own. I think they could do ESPN's Hot Wash on their own. But this really sort of adds a nice polish to it, and both ways. I think Rousey's benefiting from the fact that she's right next to the men. So maybe there's part of that too. They want to position her next to men. They don't want her to do all the work herself. And it's a win for the fans. I don't see much to complain about.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to be clear. I'm not complaining. I guess
a little bit complaining.
I'm really not. What's there to complain? You're going to see the fight. It doesn't matter where. I'm just wondering
if Chris Weidman to come east. You're sick of going.
Well, I think that's ludicrous.
There is that.
I honestly am not complaining. I guess my question to you guys is she ready to do this on her own? She's done it twice. One was, it exceeded everyone's expectation. The second one, while it wasn't a great card and was hit with injuries, wasn't the best. So, but do you think that she has done enough? I think she has. So that was my question. Yeah, of course, it doesn't matter if you see the fight on January 3rd or January, whatever. Yeah. But that was just what I was thinking about.
And I know the UFC has gone against this on at least one occasion, but generally speaking, if there are more than one title fights on a card, the headliner is the heavier weight. So in the case of Rousey, essentially that means that the only other title fights that could be on a card where she's the headliner would be a Demetrius Johnson fight or this new strawweight division. I have a feeling they're not going to headline a fight card with 2 women's championship fights. I think that would be a little bit
interesting.
It would be interesting. I don't know that they would do that. But I think, as Chuck pointed out, he used the word transcendent. And I think that's what we're going to find out about Ronda Rousey. We know that she's a star in the sort of the bigger universe of the sports world. She's the person. If you go out there and if we walked outside of this building here in New York and started asking people on the street, just started throwing names at them of UFC champions, Ronda Rousey would probably get a bigger name recognition than any other champion, I would say. But within the bubble of MMA world, is she as big of a star as other guys? Well, so far we don't think that she is, but maybe she will become one. And she sort of has to become one if they're going to move forward and keep going with 13 pay-per-views per year with 10 champions.
It also could be a little bit of a remark on Chris Weidman himself, like maybe he's partially, maybe he's not selling like that. Maybe that's where some of the doubt comes from that as well.
Also, real quickly, one reason why you're even asking the question, is she ready, is because she has co-mained so many times now. You're like, well, do we have enough evidence to really know if she can headline? I think we do. The one you talked about, the 450K against Liz Carmouche, that would, to me, be sufficient evidence, and again, for all the other anecdotal evidence as well. But it's like the more she co-mains, the more you're like, okay, we don't really know for sure. We don't have a body of work to sort of examine. And to me, this continues that, but that's a minor problem.
And the Carmouche fight was so special with the prime time. It was a great prime
huge.
time.
Yeah, it's so different.
The McMahon one, it was such a quick turnaround, and McMahon really wasn't doing anything to promote that fight as well. It just kind of came and went. So it really shows you that if they lock in and promote a fight the right way, it doesn't really matter who, that people will come. And that was special, of course, because it was historic, being the first women's fight in UFC history. The other interesting piece of news that came out yesterday was that Anderson Silva and Mauricio Shogun Rua will be the coaches on TUF Brazil 4, but they will not fight. And let's be honest, I mean, we don't really care about TUF Brazil 4. I mean, yeah, the guys come out of it, but we're not sitting there watching it week to week. Am I wrong? Or are you watching it?
No.
No, we're not watching it.
I watch TUF Latin America, but that's it.
Yeah, but that's because you're a homer for that part of the world.
That's true.
Let's be honest.
I
We don't watch it week to week, but I think it's interesting because is this the future of TUF? You know, they don't have to fight, and that's been a problem for us, right? We don't want to see these guys hung up on the sidelines waiting for months to see a season play out. It's like Melendez-Pettis, did they really need to be a part of this season? I'd have rather seen them fight sooner rather than later. So are you okay with this switch? Is this enough of a switch for TUF or not really?
Well, is it going to be, is Anderson Silva, this is my question, is Anderson Silva going to, he's going to fight, what, January 31st?
Yeah.
How long does this take him out of action? Because if they're filming it after that, it really doesn't matter if he's facing Shogun Rua, if they're taking him out of action. That would be my whole thing. I get really, really tired of when they book these things. Everybody's like, oh man, it's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
And you see things like, I can't wait to see what this guy what kind of knowledge he imparts on these things. I don't care about any of that. Does anybody care about that?
No.
That's one of those things that you're like, if Peyton Manning comes back from his neck injury, and you have all these doubts as to how he's going to look. If you're using Anderson Silva, you say, well, what's going to happen? And he comes back and he has the sort of year that he did in 2012 where they go 13-3. And then they say, you know what we want to do now, though? We're going to take him out for a little bit and watch him coach some of these younger players that you don't care about at all, really. You don't know that. It just doesn't make sense. I'm really tired of them plucking active fighters, especially a guy who's going to be 40 in April, and putting him on the sideline. So if he gets put on the sideline, I think this is the dumbest thing they could do.
But isn't that the beauty? He doesn't have to fight Shogun. So essentially,
it's true. But I'm saying if he's out if he's out an extended period of time, it bothers me because
I feel like this eliminates it because all he has to do is
that's
commit
what I'm
6
saying.
weeks.
We'll have to see on this one, but I'm still, you still think of the John Jones, kind of getting put on the sideline with doing it with Chael Sonnen. Then you had Anthony Pettis, who will be out like a year and a half essentially. I mean, those types of things. I really can't stand them taking active fighters because does anybody care how Anthony Pettis is really coaching this season?
Right.
It's like there's competing interests here. Fox wants reality television because that's it's cheap to produce and it gets ratings, I guess, across the board. All the different reality TV shows seem to do pretty well, so they want that. The UFC wants to use this as a promotional tool for their big guys. So up till now they've used it as an opportunity to pump up the Pettis-Melendez fight, but I don't know that it's really, maybe they would know better than we know how well it's doing for them, how they feel like it's a success.
Right.
Clearly they're willing to abandon that in this case. But I'm sort of with Chuck on this about the whole idea of using active fighters, not just because it takes them out of action, but because I'm not as interested in watching those guys coach. I actually think this was the one example where the Bellator reality show did it right because I was really interested in watching Greg Jackson coaching fighters. And I would love to see if the UFC decided to do something with a guy like Pederneiras and Ludwig, like just to quote, to cite a couple of guys who were active in last weekend's big fight, a couple of coaches who are going against each other, and we're really seeing how guys are getting coached in the gym. I'd be interested in watching that. I would actually watch the show, not just the fight, because I'd want to see how the training goes and what they do.
I wonder how much of it is a reflection of what's going on in Brazil. You interviewed Guilherme for the preview show, and you asked him, how was the buzz for this? And he was like, it was slow, but eventually people came around. And it seemed to be right for the United States, too, actually, probably to a lesser extent, but had a similar trajectory. And I don't know that things are necessarily cold there, but losing all the champions that they did, and that boom period can't last forever. They're really trying to emphasize star power. And so you say, well, these two guys aren't fighting, but then the response would be like, right, but it's Anderson Silva and it's Shogun. And I'm assuming they're going to fight on the same card when it's all over, right?
Who knows?
Okay, well, that would make the most sense. Again, I don't know that they will do that. But
they haven't announced that, so again,
who knows? But let's assume that happens. Then you bring, that was what the original return to Brazil was about. Nogueira, Shogun, Anderson. This recaptures a little bit of that magic. And so, you're in the situation where it's the same thing with TUF too, Matt Hughes and Rich Franklin. It's like, Okay, 2 guys, 2 different weight classes. I don't know what this is all about, but those were the big guys leading the UFC charge, and it may have worked for TUF 2, and it might work for TUF Brazil 4.
I'm fine with it. I really feel like this helps eliminate some of those issues with guys being on the sideline. I don't know if it's a big enough change. Plus, they're filming this in Las Vegas, which, you know, for the Brazilian
it's less about Shogun. It's more to his point about Anderson. That's the one where you give it. It's a little weird.
Absolutely. Imagine if Shogun loses, you know, in a little over a week against OSP, his stock has really gone down. But again, it's not about, oh, these guys have an issue and they're going to fight each other. I think you make a great point. It's about the idols coming back and giving back. And it's something that Globo, because this won't air on Fox, something that Globo can say, wow, it's Anderson Silva, you know, coaching and giving back to the younger guys. I think that's more exciting than just another season of The Ultimate Fighter. And that's what they should do here in the States. Bring back some legends to do it as well.
When you phrased the question, you were sort of originally saying, or asking us what we think this is kind of what's going forward, you know, with TUF in general, and that's still to be seen. But will they? The season they're having right now is a big deal because they're going to crown a champion at the end of it. What's going to happen with the next season? Are they going to do something like this, where they're going to get a couple of veteran fighters who are just stars, bring them out, or get people who are no longer active fighters? I mean, who knows what they're going to do next?
They should do something like that, because Anthony Pettis, you know, in the time that he's sort of, I know he's had some injuries and stuff, but it's like in the time he's been away, Donald Cerrone's fought like 5 times. I mean, guys like that are just moving mountains.
And if you watch the season, there's nothing going on between Gilbert and Anthony.
Yeah, there's
0.
I know. It's not helping sell their fight, let's put it that way.
No, and rather telling, you know, being in Brazil last week, a lot of the journalists were asking Dana, like, who's the coach for TUF Brazil? They're still into it. And it tells me that TUF as a franchise is still very valuable overseas, and it can help grow those markets. But when's the last time you heard a journalist or anyone, or even a fan, say, who's coaching the next season of The Ultimate Fighter here in the States? TUF 21. Who's talking about that?
Yeah,
it's very telling, right?
No one's asked me that in a long time. I would also say, though, like the Brazilians, and you know, you've been to that market a lot, and Guilherme could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I just get a sense that the Brazilians are, and we do it too, but they do it way more, hero worship. They're big time into hero worship. And what bigger heroes than those 2 guys? So they're not going to compete, but if they're on the same card, you still get a lot of the same effect, just without. I admit that fight would be cool, but it's not going to happen.
Let's stick with Brazilian MMA. Yeah, Jose Aldo comes out and wins on Saturday night. Tremendous fight, one of the great fights of 2014. And I thought it was extra important because, man, it did not look good for the Brazilian crowd that night. I mean, it was late into Sunday, or early into Sunday morning, late into Saturday night.
Thank God for Fabio Maldonado.
Yeah, for a moment, you kind of felt like, okay, Maldonado will win, and then Glover might win, and this will end well. It didn't happen with Glover, but the early fights, they were not looking good at all. And I felt like Jose Aldo had to come out there, not only to remain the only Brazilian UFC champion currently, but just to keep Brazilian MMA going. Walid Ismail telling me on Monday that he saved Brazilian MMA. Now, that might be a stretch, but is there something to that? Do you feel like if Jose Aldo would have lost on Saturday night in dramatic fashion to Chad Mendes, that Brazilian MMA would be in deep trouble?
I made this point a couple times, and I don't know if people don't believe me or I've been ineffective in arguing, but it could be a lot of the both. Combat sports, less so boxing, but certainly MMA in Japan and in the 20th century throughout Brazil was part of a boom and bust cycle. It had these huge waves of explosions. Sorry, there's a guy with a ladder there. There he is, you can see him in the camera. Huge waves of explosions in popularity, and then it would die for one reason or another. And then it would come back, and then it would die again. Now, the UFC did it differently and better than the other 2 times it happened. And remember, the last one that bottomed out was because of a brawl on, a really ugly brawl, basically. And so they have this global deal, and that's got some tenure, and they got this Ultimate Fighter deal. They're doing things differently this time to prevent them from having this boom-bust cycle. But at some point, there is a natural tendency for those things to still play themselves out in the way that they do. And I'm not here to say that they're headed towards a bust. I just mean that this sport in this way, particularly in Brazil, lends itself to these highs and these lows. UFC is trying to protect themselves against it, and it's a very, very hard thing to do.
Yeah, you remember when the UFC first went back to Brazil and they loaded up a card with it seemed like every fight had a Brazilian in it and against somebody from somewhere else, and it was like Brazilian wins, every single fight. And I don't know whether it was all just the UFC saying we're going to put these guys in against people they can beat, but it seemed that way to a certain extent. And they don't do that anymore. Now, the Brazilian guys are fighting against people who are, on their level, and it could go either way. And I think that's one thing that's a little different. Not having a champion, just a world where Jose Aldo loses, and now there's nobody from Brazil who's a champion. It does take some luster off. I don't know that it's I don't know that I would say it's a fatal, long-lasting problem, but it's something that, at least for the time being, would have really taken a lot of the luster off of Brazilian MMA. Where everybody's a front runner. We all want our local guys to do well, and especially if you're from another country, you see that the big old United States has all the champions, but we've still got our one guy. When that one guy goes down to another American, that would have been a big deal, I think.
It was. It felt like it was not just about Brazil. It was like he was sort of the last guy for the globe, right? Like otherwise, it's all North American champions, which was a sort of unique situation, especially as the UFC has sort of put it in fifth and trying to globalize and make it, hit all these new markets and stuff. It just seemed like. That's the exact thing you wouldn't want. GSP is no longer the champion right now in Canada, et cetera, et cetera. It's like you're not getting that reach into these other markets, and so I felt like there was a little bit of that sort of like, hey, Aldo, unless it's all going to come to America, you just sort of stand up and do this. But I thought his performance too was also like what really stood out to me, because here's a guy I think a lot of people thought. If he had some weaknesses, this was a guy who knew how to exploit them. Possibly, he has good wrestler. He's been stand up. His stand up has improved. He's looked better, I think, through time. Chad Mendes, I'm talking about, and he was able to sort of withstand everything that he got, and return it. And went through some heavy weather in that fight. His face was pretty busted up, but he didn't fade. Like a lot of times we've seen him fade in deep rounds, he was able to sort of maintain his level. To me, I thought it was great that he even looked like a sort of the vintage Jose Aldo. I think a lot of us were like, oh yeah, he's sort of coasting now. And it was nice. It was nice of him to not just.
He coasted in that fourth round.
Well, he did. He did, but not as like he wasn't fading in terms of you just felt like his cardio was shot.
He took it off a little bit. Yeah.
So it had multi layers, but it was a great performance for him.
And for him to come out in the fifth round and win the fifth round, I think that was a big deal. Even though obviously the scorecards, it wasn't that important, but we don't know that as it was happening. But just for the perception of this guy, to see him go out in the fifth round and be the fresher, stronger, feistier fighter, the guy who really took it to his opponent, that hasn't been happening in other fights. Now, of course, a lot of his other fights, he could coast because it was pretty clear that he was winning big. This fight, I thought he was ahead going into the fifth. I thought it was pretty clear, but it was a pretty tight fight. It was a really competitive fight.
One sort of point, and I want to make this clear, it's not, what I'm about to say is not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree. But if you've traveled around a little bit in the world, you figure out pretty quickly that the United States, and North America too, but really the United States, we are the most sports-friendly country on earth, I think. I would submit that. There are not nearly as many professional sports are supported here as there are in other countries. Which isn't to say we love sports more, but we love them very differently. If you go to South America, if you go to parts of Asia, certainly in Europe, they have one or two, maybe three sports they like. Here, it's insane how many sports we watch. College football, college basketball, NBA, NHL, UFC. I could go on, and all of these. I mean, the CrossFit Games did 800,000 views on ESPN. The CrossFit Games. This is insane. You don't see this phenomenon in other countries at all. And I don't pretend to know how the Brazilians exactly enjoy MMA. I can watch from afar and sort of think things through and listen to what Guilherme tells you and tells me too. But I would just sort of prepare ourselves to the idea that they may not enjoy UFC and watch UFC in the same way that as a Canadian or as an American now, that we look at things and how we view UFC as part of sort of a general sporting diet. They may have a different relationship to the product. And so as the dynamics change, so does their enthusiasm. Again, we're all like the hometown guys too here. People from, Cotto fights at Madison Square Garden down the street for a reason, right? There's a lot of Puerto Ricans here. He's Puerto Rican. We get it. But I just mean though that the relationship that we have, we're willing to accept certain sports for as they are because it's a sport. I don't know that the rest of the world necessarily thinks of things, particularly like combat sports, in that way. If I'm wrong, please correct me, but that's just my hunch.
And I would piggyback on that and say it's a little bit more like watching the Olympics in a sense. I think that a lot of places around the world, people, they pick out their hometown or their home country people and they root hard for them, just the same way that that the Americans do every 4 years, every 2 years for the Olympics. We pick out the American athletes and we root hard, but the rest of the time, we're not necessarily all rooting for the guy from our country. I don't think every American was rooting for Chad Mendes the other night. I think that pretty much every Brazilian was rooting for Jose Aldo, though, and I think that's kind of what you're driving at. I think that's a real different way of watching things.
I think maybe we dilute ourselves a little bit as well because we do have so many sports. So if you're in America, if you're at a UFC in America, it's completely different than being at a UFC in Brazil, where it is very loud and they break out in chants and it's just this passionate undertaking. It almost feels like there's nothing happening outside of it. It's
that's just a press row.
Yeah, and that's press row.
Am I crazy for thinking that Jose Aldo is the most underappreciated fighter in the UFC? I mean, really, I feel like this guy does not get his due. He's first ballot Hall of Fame, if we want to pretend like that actually exists.
Best featherweight ever.
Best featherweight ever.
No argument.
One of the greatest, one of the greatest champions as far as his winning streak and what he's done in Zuffa and his stats. And I still feel like, I'm still wondering, okay, is this the performance that's going to make him into a star in Brazil? Is this the performance that's going to make him into a star here in North America? I wonder if it's just because he doesn't speak English. He hasn't made the effort to put himself out there. But I truly feel like people don't appreciate him, and he'll be one of those fighters who you only appreciate when he's gone. We'll look back and be like, that guy was unbelievable. Look what he did to Uriah Faber in his prime. Look what he did to Mike Brown in his prime. Look what he did to Chad Mendes. Do you not agree?
I don't know what you mean by appreciate.
I don't feel like we talk about him the same way we talk about John Jones, Ronda Rousey, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture. These legends, or soon-to-be legends, Anderson Silva. I mean, you put his stats next to Anderson, they're comparable.
Their resume is not the same.
As far as what? The winning streak? Or, I mean, he can only fight who he's been...
So there was an argument for a while floating around, like, what's the difference between GSP's and Anderson Silva's resume? Probably a number of things, right? GSP had some losses, while Anderson had that 16-0 run. Anderson had switched weight classes. There's a lot of ways to sort of, how do you define the dominance at the highest degree? And my argument was always that GSP beat basically 3 generations of welterweights, which to me was a more significant achievement, even if he had a couple of losses in there. People may not agree, that's fine. But for Aldo's resume, his resume is impeccable for what it is. There's no other featherweight that can come close. But and I argued this before, the fight with Mendes is great for any number of reasons, not least of which was it's the best Aldo fight ever. It's also the best Mendes fight ever. But Aldo, prior to that, he was doing things well in the WEC. But I don't know, he kind of had some soft moments in his career there a little bit. He had
soft in what way? Where he looked beatable?
Aldo is always misrepresented. He's always presented as this like, oh my God, he's this Melvin Manhoff guy, only he's more accurate, which is really not the case. He is a defensively minded guy who also happens to be capable of extreme amounts of offense when he selectively, carefully chooses to use it. That's a very unusual thing, but he should be thought of as much more of as a careful defensive fighter. And I think what happens is anybody who knows MMA can look at his resume and be like, well, I mean, this is unimpeachable. But when you say appreciate, I think what you're saying is Anderson Silva was front kicking guys in the face and changing weight classes. There was a dynamism to his fights. The way I would describe Jose Aldo is, absent that fight on Saturday, which was different, he's much more efficient, calculating, effective. That is not the same thing. And that to me, along with other reasons, explains why there may be some lack of interest.
And I should say that I don't think that, I'm not trying to say he's better than Anderson. I don't like those discussions.
Yeah, you can't have that.
But I just feel like we don't view him in the same light.
He also doesn't have charisma in the same way.
True.
He's not as media friendly, like you mentioned. There is the barrier. I know Anderson has humor, like that he injects in some awkward things too. But he's got those things actually play in when you're talking about the scope of perception, like on this guy. But I will also say that with one of the reasons that Conor McGregor is getting so much attention is because he's Irishman and all that, but he's also a featherweight. Like it's like he's bringing the featherweight division to something. It's like the featherweight division has not been a traditionally looked at glamour division in the UFC. It only was introduced a few years ago into the UFC. WEC was almost like a clique of diehard fans, really. I don't know how many casual fans really watch the WEC. So in some ways, it's like he has some catching up to do to all the years of GSP's fights, all the big momentum of GSP's fight, and Anderson Silva and the rest of those guys.
I also feel like, and I think if we would have talked about Anderson pre-Chael and post-Chael, it's 2 different discussions. Everyone needs a foil. Ali needed Frazier, Bird needed Magic, Hulk Hogan needed the Iron Sheik, right? Everyone needs a foil. I don't. That's pro wrestling.
God, I hate you.
And that's why Conor is so interesting, because Conor is poking that bear that no one really poked. And I feel like Aldo almost needs Conor more than Conor needs Aldo. You know what I'm saying? Conor, it doesn't matter
true.
who's
just
champion.
Like Silva and Sonnen. I mean, you could look
it's
at
the
it the same way.
exact same thing. And I don't like to compare McGregor and Sonnen, but that's where, in my opinion, the comparison is 100%. Aldo needed that foil. He needed that rivalry, and he may get it, of course, if Conor gets by Dennis Silva. We'll talk about that in a second. But I feel like that's what makes this so interesting. And McGregor going to Brazil and ripping the crowd and ripping their idol, as they call him, their champion.
Was he down in Brazil this last week?
He was. Yeah, I don't know if you saw.
I didn't notice.
He was very under the radar.
He wasn't staying in your hotel, was he?
Fertitta Hotel.
Yeah.
But do you guys agree that he is actually going to elevate Aldo almost more so, or to a degree maybe the same, but that's not the important part here. He's going to elevate a guy who has needed some kind of elevation for quite some time.
I would say he will if he gets to that fight, but I would put it in different terms than you will, because I think obviously the promotional side of the talking he will, but I think even as a fighter, because he's a stand-up fighter and he comes at you, and I think that's the kind of fighter that Jose Aldo can really shine against, or maybe he'll be exposed. Who knows? I mean, I don't think he will.
But it's not just about the fight here, right?
It's not
about
just
everything
about the fight.
else.
But I think that part of the deal is with Aldo is, what does it look like at the end of his fights? Oftentimes, you see his opponent standing there sort of like downcast, waiting for Aldo to get his arm raised because Aldo won a decision. He's finished some fights. He certainly finished Mendes the first time they fought, and he's had some other finishes. But a lot of times, he's the guy who just beats you and wins a very comfortable decision. A little bit like GSP became later on in his career. And GSP had already sort of developed his star power. And so a lot of people complained about the fact that GSP wasn't finishing people anymore, but he already had established that star power. And I think Aldo, kind of in a smaller way, established something when he was in the WBC and he was finishing people. But since then, he had smaller star power, and it hasn't grown as much because he hasn't had that kind of that same fire I don't know. I mean, he's had the fire in him, but it hasn't really exploded out of him into the other guys.
People will care. That's the difference. Conor McGregor, people care now. They already care because either they want him to lose and be exposed, which is a different kind of, you're going to draw attention, it's going to be compelling on that point, or they want him to continue to be like, it's just like Chael Sonnen in that sense, because I feel like what happened with Anderson Silva is everybody was either like, he's going to get his comeuppance, he's going to get beat. But they also had an epic first fight. There was a lot of elements to that. But I felt like the thing that happened was if people didn't have a vested interest in Anderson Silva beforehand, they suddenly did because of Chael Sonnen entering that equation, because they cared how much. They cared if they might change hands or they wanted to see Chael Sonnen lose. I feel like that's where McGregor's entering that space.
And I said this a couple of days ago. I feel like Chael did more for Anderson than Anderson did for Chael. And what I mean by that is that Chael was a locomotive, as is Conor McGregor. They were going after whoever's at the top. It doesn't matter if he's black, white, brown. It doesn't matter if his name's Silva or Aldo or GSP. Right? I mean, they're just going for the guy, and that's what makes them special. They're skipping over 8 through 2, and they're calling out that guy saying, "I'm going to beat you," when a lot of people think they don't deserve it. The champion needed someone to get his juices flowing, to get people talking about it. Even look at what Chad Mendes did. Chad Mendes poked the bear. And people are into this fight, and I feel like it's going to be that much more with Conor McGregor.
I mean, yes and no. I would say it's. I'm not sure I agree with that. Which is to say,
You're not allowed to disagree.
Oh, damn it! Well, here's what I would say. It's not that I'm saying like what you're saying is wrong in the sense that look at the locomotive that is Conor McGregor with Jose Aldo. I mean, it's impossible to ignore all the things that he's done, but it's been a shorter amount of time. And here's what I mean by that: what he's banking off of is. If someone challenged it, I mean, look at the dominance of Demetrius Johnson. If someone came up and challenged it, you'd be like, all right, challenge it. I mean, you're probably going to lose, whatever, maybe you don't, I don't know. The point being is there's a certain, that division on Saturday night, and Jose Aldo to a lesser extent, it sort of took on a new turn. It rose in its prominence and its greatness. And Dana White always is like, well, these divisions take time to build, and you often think it's a cop-out, but it's not. You just need a certain amount of time for guys to have history between themselves and national rivalries and rematches. What Conor McGregor needs, though, is for all that to take place, which takes years to happen. Yes, he can challenge it in, the however long he's been in the UFC now. How long has it been? A year and a half? Yeah, so the year and a half he can come and he can bang on the door. But all that work had to be done ahead of time. All that greatness had to be established. All that rivalry had to be there for him to then come and shake it up. So yes, he's done a lot of work in the last year and a half, but he needed Aldo to be who he is, which took all that time and all that resume to build, and that's when the two are meeting.
Yeah, I hate to agree with Luke. It really bothers me, but
I'm used to that from my colleagues.
But I mean, bringing it back to Sonnen. If all that Chael Sonnen did was talk about Yushin Okami and then beat him, and talk about I guess it was Marquardt after that and beat him, and that was sort of, and then he hits a brick wall and that's it. All we would be talking about Chael Sonnen was, he was a guy who liked to talk a lot. He could beat middle level guys, but when he could go out there and dominate the greatest fighter of all time for 4.5 plus rounds, that was what established Chael Sonnen as something special. It wasn't just the talking. He could talk, but if that first fight against Anderson Silva had gone this way, where Chael Sonnen goes out, goes for a double leg takedown, and Silva like hits him in the knee just as he's coming in on him, and the fight's over, all that, he would not be remembered.
But remember, let's go back to August of 2010. This is UFC 117, right? I feel like at the time there were people who were saying Anderson's pound for pound #1. Some were saying Fedor, right? There was that debate going on. We weren't calling him the greatest of all time then. I think Chael brought that out in us. Like after what he did to Chael, coming back in the 5th round and then doing it again, and then everything else afterwards, then we started saying this is the greatest of all time. But people weren't going out there and saying Anderson is the greatest of all time. That's a newer thing.
But what you're saying is that it's mutually beneficial. I don't know that Chael
But what I'm saying is Aldo would be remembered as Hall of Famer, great champion, all that stuff. But McGregor is going to put him at a different level. McGregor is going to bring something out of him, and McGregor doesn't necessarily need Aldo, because if Mendes is the champion who's just defending his title for the first time, McGregor's stock is going to go way up.
But he needs somebody. I mean, that's the
he needs
point.
Someone, of course. You can't fight yourself.
He doesn't need Jose Aldo, but he needs a guy
Aldo's been
who is at the
lacking
top.
that rivalry.
But in both cases, you're talking about Silva and you're talking about Aldo. Now, you can make a comment about Silva pound for pound best or best ever. Here's what we know for sure: best middleweight ever. That's not up for debate at all.
At the time, yeah, we were saying that.
Well, even now, he's the best middleweight ever. And then also you have Jose Aldo, best featherweight ever. They need a certain level of greatness to do it. And so my only issue is just the timeline you're referring to. Yes, more recently, Conor McGregor is going to do things, or Chael did things for Chael, for Anderson. But that body of work is what made Chael needed those guys to do all the heavy lifting for him to bounce it off of.
Fair. I guess it's a chicken or egg thing, right?
Yeah, maybe.
But I still maintain, and I'll move along, I still maintain that these champions who are lacking something, I mean, they have these fights, Ricardo Lamas, Hominick, these fights are just kind of coming and going. Someone poking the bear and bringing it out in them, I think, is compelling stuff. Let's talk about Conor for a second, because right after this show, it was announced that he'll be fighting Dennis Siver. And I feel right now that you could make that Aldo fight right now and no one would complain. Everyone wants to see it, especially what happened in Brazil. Is this a risk? I mean, I get it, putting him in Boston after the NFC Championship game on a Sunday on Fox
AFC.
Sports 1. Well, no, it'll be, Fox will be promoting that during the NFC Championship game. Of course, it'll be after the CBS game, but they'll have that platform, right? Mm-hmm. I get that, and putting him in Boston again makes sense, and it's a great card, Benson and Eddie Alvarez, tremendous stuff. But we've seen this before where you roll the dice, Crow Cop and Gonzaga, and many other times before. Is this too big of a risk in your opinion? What do you think?
No, I don't know how you guys feel. I mean, for me, the only thing is it's interesting why did they make this fight? Because everything was pointed. Yeah, everything was pointed one way, and all of a sudden it's like, we're gonna fight Dennis Siver on Fox. Yeah. What? Wait, time out. What happened? I wonder if Fox was like, we want some of that Conor McGregor juice. We want some of it. We want part of that before you put them on pay-per-view. Because once you put them on pay-per-view, there's really often not, unless they've gone a down streak or something. Right. There's really no going back. So they were like, let us have some of that before you move on to that whatever you do. And so maybe UFC trying to be accommodating was like, all right, who can we give? I would say this about Dennis Siver. I expect him to lose. I'm picking Conor McGregor, unless he comes out with some injury or something. But I would say this, and everyone was like, oh my God, they're not giving him wrestlers. And they're not. It's true. But Dennis Siver, just a little bit, can wrestle. And so for me, I expect Conor McGregor to win, but I would not be surprised if just a little bit you see Dennis Siver push him and make him fight back in ways that Diego Brandao simply is not capable of doing, or Marcus Brimage is simply not capable of doing.
Do you think Conor's stock will rise that much more going into this fight and after this fight to where it justifies not doing the title fight now? Because I feel like that's what this is. This is another showcase for him to make him all that much more popular when he does fight for the title next year.
Well, I think that the story is not so much the guy that's in the octagon with him, but the story is how many people are in that building. I mean, the Shannon Airport to Logan in Boston, that is going to be, they're going to have a lot of flights coming over, because I'll tell you, people in Boston are going to be probably watching the AFC Championship game. They're going to be, especially if it happens to be in Foxborough.
Yeah.
If it's your Broncos against the Patriots.
But yeah, I get your
The
point.
Pats aren't going to make the playoffs, so you don't have to worry about that. I know.
Two loser teams.
People are going to, I was just trying to figure out the timing. And, the AFC Championship game starts at 6:30.
Yeah.
There might be some people who are going to end the game and are going to tune over, but as far as being in the building, people are going to want to be watching the game. They're not going to be sitting. So you're going to have a building full of Irishmen, basically.
That's a great point.
It is a big building. I mean, I was thinking the same thing because in Dublin, what was that? That's
9,000.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that seats double that, and it's happening in a place where they just happen to have the football team. The exact same thing was going through my mind. So I don't know how that'll play out, but it is as a headlining spot. As a non-champion, it's a big. I guess it's going to be a gauge to figure out just how big Conor McGregor really is.
Yeah, and I guess I have a bit of a problem, and you could say this about a lot of different cases, but I view Conor as sort of a lottery ticket these days. He's kind of becoming, in a sense, like Floyd, only because I feel like Floyd gets to call his shots and Conor is getting to call his shots. Yeah, let's go for Dustin Poirier. Give him Dustin Poirier. Dennis Seaver pissed me off. I'm going to go
It's
after
not
him.
like he's paying. He sits down with Uncle Frank and
Right,
they solve
exactly.
that.
But do you have a problem with a guy who's one fight removed from a PED suspension getting this lottery ticket?
No.
Does Dennis Seaver deserve this?
Would deserve what? The beating he's likely to take?
He's getting a big platform.
I mean, okay. Well, no. There's so many other PED problems we could point to that
Sure.
this one. And first of all, he already had one fight where I guess ostensibly he tested clean.
Right.
I guess we would have heard about it by now if he hadn't. So he's on. There is some sort of redemption you have to give a guy. But no, I don't know that that's enough of a disqualifying fact. And he's really usable for the UFC. Dennis Seaver. I mean, we would all look at him and be like, "Who is Dennis Seaver?" He's a credible fighter. He's a credible fighter. He's got his own limits. Not the guy who can beat the best in the world, but he's a credible talent. They're not giving him some sort of strike force, setup where it's like, here's Robbie Lawler versus your garbage man. And your garbage man gets his teeth knocked out in like 30 seconds. It's not like that at all, But here's one thing I would say about this: Dennis Seaver's a credible fighter, but to your kind of point, there's not the PED part, but the flip side is. So many people always being like, I want a credible challenge for Conor McGregor. I want a credible challenge. I don't think he's like Floyd Mayweather, at least not permanently. In the UFC, and I said this on my chat yesterday, your day of reckoning is coming, one time or another. When you get the rise up, there's two ways to do it. You can do it the Khabib Nurmagomedov way, where you beat nothing but killers one way up there, or you can do what McGregor's doing, which is sort of like navigating the waters. But eventually people are like, what happens if he gets a title shot? Okay, let's say he beats Aldo even by a fluke, knocks him out 10 seconds, bang, he's got the champion. Who do you think he's going to be fighting? You can only play that wiggle game for a little bit in the UFC. Eventually, you got to fight better guys.
Sure.
You cannot avoid them in the UFC. So if I understand people being like, "Oh my God, he's fighting Dennis Seaver. This is a joke." Okay, maybe it is a joke for now. But the day of reckoning for Conor, I don't mean he's going to lose, but the day he has to fight the top guys, it is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when.
Final thing on this.
If there was somebody else available who was in the top five, that would be. That's the guy you put him in with. But, he already beat Poirier, who was, I think, number 6 when he beat him. So now he's got Seaver, who's, lower in the top 10. So it seems like it's a step backwards, but not really, because everybody else has got a dance partner, right?
Right. Although, I mean, Cub is, he's going to sit there, and if he beats Frankie Edgar and doesn't get the next title shot, he's going to probably be really pissed off.
He should. He should be pissed off.
Guys, let's move along.
Good thing he has a fighters union he can go to and rectify that problem.
I wonder if even the union would even deal with something like that. It's a great point. Like when I think of a union, that's the last thing I think of matchmaking.
I mean, if NFL unions protect people like Brandon Merriweather from bad suspensions, I can only imagine they would protect guys who were promised good things for winning.
Yeah, I guess. Can you imagine if it got to the point where the union was an actual thing and they were like, well, Sean Shelby, you said this, and we're actually going to cash it.
They would make it part of the contract, I think.
Yeah, what a messy situation that would be. Speaking of a messy situation, great segue there, unintentionally. Let's end on the rankings. The rankings were instituted by the UFC almost 2 years ago now. It's been, and at first it was a Fox thing. It was like Fox wanted to say, all right, on this show we're going to have number 3 versus number 4, number 2 versus number 1, etc. And the UFC, for the longest time, Dana White in particular, said, no way, rankings. And you knew in the back of their mind, I mean, this would be a nightmare dealing with managers and fighters. Wait a second, how's the guy who's ranked 6 getting paid more than the guy who's ranked 4? How's he getting this fight and all this stuff? It's gone to a place where I believe it is very useful to the UFC. However, there are issues with the ranking system. None of us contribute to them, and they always say it's the media rankings. our pal Mark Mundy of FoxSports.com wrote an article this week outlining some of the issues. But I just wanted to get your guys' take on how we can actually, if anyway, fix the rankings. Is it just something that you ignore? Because I feel like we all we reference them at some point when writing an article or talking about something. So is there a way of fixing these things, or is it just one of those things that the UFC is going to put out, but at the end of the day, they're just going to do whatever they want?
I mean, fixing the UFC's rankings?
Yeah.
Or fixing rankings generally?
No, the UFC's rankings.
I don't think it's repairable.
You don't?
Well, I mean, okay, it could be repaired, but given what the UFC does and doesn't want to do and how they do and don't things, no, I don't think it's repairable. The way, if you wanted to do it, you'd have to have a select group do it. You'd have to have the guys who actually know how to rank, who actually know how to do.
So that's a way of repairing it.
Well, yeah, but like, why don't guys want to contribute to the UFC rankings? Some perceive it as a conflict of interest. Others don't want to be grouped with hey, here's Donkerson in Omaha, Nebraska, who spins top 40 records but just happens to watch UFC.
Sure.
Let's get him on the rankings panel. I don't want to be next to that guy. My vote is not the same as his. Sorry, it's not. It's not the democratic process. I know more than that idiot. I don't want my ballot next to him. And so as a consequence, people who actually know something, and I'm not just saying I'm the only one, there's a bunch of people like Jordan Breen and Jack Carnesau and everyone on this panel. You all know how to rank. So if you remove those people from the process, what do you have left? You don't have a rankings. You have some sort of like weird amalgamation of bad ideas and a bad process. No thanks.
What if the UFC came to you and you don't contribute to them either? What if they came to us and said, we're going to pick 15 of the very best, the names you mentioned, and then some. We know the names.
They won't. They don't value the real media's opinion. They don't.
You wouldn't be interested?
No, absolutely not. I don't want my opinion co-opted.
But what if they said to you, we're going to leave it alone? You can add, subtract anyone you want. Like, we're truly going to leave this alone.
All right, maybe in that circumstance.
Is there a value to it? Is there a value for the sport?
Right? When you say leave it alone, I mean, I actually, when they started the rankings, I actually was part of them for a little while, and then I pulled out of them mainly because they went to a top 15. And for SI, I'm part of the rankings there, the top 10, and having to do the top 15 and the top 10 was just messy, and it just seemed like it was. It's not compensated work, obviously. They're not paying the media people for this. So I just decided to pull out. However, just a few weeks later, I would have pulled out if I hadn't already when they dropped Nate Diaz from the rankings. And I feel like that's really the one misstep that the UFC has done here. I mean, I think that there's a lot of issues with rankings, other than what Luke pointed out, of where they're just sort of letting almost anybody who's interested get involved. When they start manipulating the rankings by saying, well, this guy has a contract. We're having a little bit of a contract problem with this guy. He doesn't want to take a fight, so we're going to pull him out. Whereas, as I recall, Dominic Cruz was still in the rankings after he hadn't fought for 2.5 years. I think eventually he might have been pulled out, but I'm not even sure about that.
I don't think he was.
I think he was. I think he might have stayed in there.
Katzengano as well.
Yeah. So it was like kind of like this. If you have a contract issue with the UFC, you might get pulled out, and I feel like that's wrong. If the UFC wants to have rankings, like anything, if they want to regulate their own fights when they're not with an athletic commission, if they want to do drug testing, all these things, they have to be able to step away from it and say, we're going to do something, but we're going to have this run independently of us. They are valuable, and I would have no problem contributing to them if they were sort of set aside and there was some I don't know what you want to call it, but some credibility to what's being said.
The problem is, do you feel that the UFC thinks that there's a problem with the rankings? I feel like they look at their rankings as like, hey, what's the problem? We have people who've written, or they have DJs, whatever. They have these people voting. These are the media. He tells the media that you're the media who votes on it, but none of the media who's actually out there. I mean, I shouldn't say none, but very few of the media who are in those scrums actually vote. I mean, it's just, if they can't distinguish the difference between who the media is that's actually covering the sport daily and paying attention and dissecting every topic like we do and like people do elsewhere, then it becomes problematic. Just on that level alone, you're like, you're absolutely right. I don't really want to associate with people who, one guy, he has I was looking at some of the names, and most of them, they have MMA just as a little or they don't even mention MMA in their title at all. But they're like you said, they're just a fan of MMA. Why do you want to associate with those people? And if there's a problem, like I know that there was like a conflict with where's Seaver versus Nick Lentz. Why did these things happen?
Sometimes I feel like if the UFC announces a fight, they'll just bump a guy up. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's one thing for ESPN to cite, let's say, the top 25 college football AP coaches poll,
Sure.
where you have the Associated Press controlling it, talking to college football coaches. That'd be one thing if a separate organization did it,
That'd be nice.
had total control, and then Fox just cited that. But as long as everything is in-house, everything just seems to get complicated.
It would be nice if they did that. And if not, if you're going to have these rankings where it's these guys who don't follow the sport, why not just have the UFC rank them? Right? Like, why not just have Joe?
What difference does it make at that
right,
point?
But I'd rather that. I'd rather know what Joe Silva and Sean Shelby think of these guys.
That's true.
Like
That's a great
you know what I
point.
mean?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, the way they did it on TUF with the
exactly.
with the straw weights.
Why do you need to have this fake,
The numbers
like,
are going to be
media
next to the fighter no matter what.
And by the way, to your point, those rankings that they had on there were good.
They were great.
Yeah.
The ones that they did were
Yeah.
like really accurate.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And it's also just a chore. Honestly, when
Yeah.
it really comes down to it, you're just going in, you're just like moving your, dragging this here and here. I don't think too much thought, even from the people who participate, who you might have some admiration for in the media. It's just a process that you have to go through, and I feel like there's not a ton of thought going into each intricacy of like, oh, should I put this guy above him because against the same opponent, this. I don't know how much of that is actually in play. The types of things that should dictate where rankings play out, because if they're about matchmaking, if they're supposedly going to justify matchmaking, those things matter.
I think the thing that you asked though is, would the UFC want to fix this? I think the time the UFC would fix this would be if the rankings really don't jibe with the matchmaking. If somewhere along the line they want to make this fight, and all the people who are ranking it, put this guy way up here and this guy way down here, and it seems like a weird matchup, and it doesn't fit their view of what a fight should be, that's when they'll do something different to change it to make it work better for them. And if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
For them, and that, from their perspective, they still get those numbers next to the fighters. So why change it?
I'd love to see them just go with their own rankings, have the matchmakers do it, or a third party where you have, and that might be like some media association. This is a topic that we can probably talk about for hours. A third party with the people who truly cover this sport for a living, who know what they're talking about, and then use that. But the way it works right now, I think, is quite embarrassing at times, to be honest, the way they have these.
How about that?
That'd be nice. All right.
All right.
You start it.
Okay.
And then we'll follow your
Nicholas,
lead.
number one, everything.
Exactly.
SB Nation consensus MMA rankings that we used to do with USA Today, which was an amalgamation of like Sherdog and
Sure.
over there.
Yeah.
I still maintain to this day those are the best rankings we ever had.
Where are they?
Well, USA Today decided to do business with MMA Junkie, man. I'm teasing. And so they went away. But that process can be replicated. And
Right.
that, to me,
Right.
go back and look at those rankings. Those were the best that the sport ever had. Fact.
I
guys.
pitched that to SI one time and I got rebuffed. So yeah.
One day, we all have dreams. That is one of my dreams. Guys, great stuff. Great show. Appreciate the time as always. Appreciate your time as always. Enjoy your Halloween tomorrow. These guys have great costume ideas and they'll all be tweeting them, right?
I'm going as Ariel Helwani.
Wow.
Chuck Mindenhall.
Wow.
Smurfette.
Got my hat on.
See? So check out their Twitters tomorrow. They're going to be tweeting them. I cannot wait for that. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you watching. We'll be back next week for another episode of the MMA Beat. A relatively quiet weekend coming up in the world of mixed martial arts, but I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Enjoy your weekend.